Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? This week there's been a few interesting developments. Everything from the inability of anti-vaxxers to do basic math, to the influence of drinking 6 cups of coffee a day, although we question those findings. Philippines approving golden rice and being one of the first countries to do so. That Bayer will cease production of glyphosates by 2023, and just how a particular jaunt to the ISS caused the entire space station to spin itself around. Starting with anti-vaxxers, and this time it relates to the COVID-19 vaccines. Many people have made outlandish and extreme claims about the COVID-19 vaccines. Everything from they cause sterility through to they're full of microchips. Not quite as bad as the claims that 5G was implanting COVID into you, but still nowhere near reality. Why we say anti-vaxxers don't know how to do simple math comes down to a few examples that demonstrate an overall pattern of behavior. Primarily, it's a case of how many people are going to hospital who haven't been vaccinated, how many people are going to hospital who have been vaccinated, and just what the rates of vaccination and non-vaccination are. It boils down to the difference between the groups who have been vaccinated and who have not been vaccinated and would then require hospitalization. The more people who get vaccinated, the more the vaccinated group represents the percentage requiring hospitalization, and the smaller the cohort of unvaccinated individuals needs to be. In both cases, the total number of hospitalizations is driven down. This is because no matter how many people you are going to get vaccinated, there are always going to be some individuals who either can't be vaccinated for medical reasons, won't be vaccinated for religious or personal reasons, and in some cases, the vaccine just doesn't take. In this instance, you need to look at just what's happening to the cohort who either hasn't been vaccinated, as is the case at present, or once you have an established herd immunity, just what the rates of hospitalization are for the disease. If you aren't vaccinated, there's a much higher incidence of needing to go to the hospital, and this is why, as a relative percentage, they present a much higher percentage of the total people being hospitalized. If you take 1 million people, and you split it evenly down the middle, and you get different rates of admission to hospital, then yes, if one is higher than the other, there's a sound point to be made. When you get 2 differently sized groups, that's when you need to start standardizing to some value. The exact value doesn't matter, so long as it's applied the same across both groups. The most common is generally either 1 in 100,000, or whatever the rate happens to be per that 100,000. This demonstrates the problem with their math. They're not comparing apples to apples, they're trying to compare apples to oranges. By getting a common standard, you can then compare things in a common way. Doing otherwise is simply not reasonable and doesn't work as a math equation, and it's why the anti-vaxxers fail basic math. In fact, with how bad this is, we question whether or not some of them have managed to complete even rudimentary math in school. Going now from the CCP virus to another virus, or more accurately, group of viruses. In the UK, there is an increasing number of children who are being admitted to hospital with respiratory syncytial virus. This is an infection that affects children's lungs. The problem with it is how unseasonal the current surge actually is. Why has there been a sudden increase in the number of children being admitted for things like bronchiolitis? Normally this is something you would see in winter. In the UK, where this is being observed, it's currently the middle of summer. The answer is surprisingly straightforward. The large-scale lockdowns and restrictions in movement and similar have more or less curtailed the spread of these viruses. Once the gates have been opened and people begin moving freely once more, you have the spread of disease. It's very much why we expect to see a significant increase in the number of influenza cases either this year, assuming lockdowns are lifted adequately, or next year, for those countries that have had extreme lockdown measures put in place. The upside to the current situation is that, for the most part, the children diagnosed with this don't need much more than paracetamol for the fever and fluids. This, in combination with rest, allows them to recover. The problem is when it gets more advanced, and they actually have their breathing inhibited. Inflammation in the bronchioles means that air can't get to the alveoli and therefore can't be exchanged with the rest of the body. All the actions taken to stop the spread of COVID-19 have had implications for many other viruses and diseases spreading. Diseases that we generally have taken for granted. Things like the common cold and influenza. RSV has had a reduction of about 84%. That means we're down to 16% of the roughly 3.5 million children globally diagnosed with it each year. Going from diseases to coffee now, and why some research indicates that the benefit of coffee now may haunt you later in life. Notably, drinking 6 cups or more of coffee a day might be harmful for you in the long run. Unfortunately for us, this particular study was at least somewhat well populated, with a little over 17,700 people, aged between 37 and 73. It did, however, rely on biobank project data, which means this is a retrospective analysis. The analysis found that those who consume 6 or more cups of coffee a day had more than 50% higher risk of getting dementia in later life than those who had 1 or 2 cups. Considering that coffee is one of the most consumed beverages in the world along with tea, this is not a particularly encouraging statistic. Although not the most robust conclusion. What they found was that the more coffee you consumed over your lifetime, the more likely you were to have a reduced brain volume towards the end of your life. This is one of the risk factors and indicators for dementia. That would mean that there may be some relationship between coffee consumption and dementia. Although it's also possible that what they found is not an indication of causing dementia, but early signs or risk factors of dementia being dealt with by caffeine in coffee. Going from coffee to the continent that produces most of the world's coffee, a giant vampire bat fossil was found in an Argentinian cave. The jawbone came from a vampire bat that was about 50 centimeters. This is a little bit less wide than a soccer ball. The bat itself, fortunately, has long since died out, although it did live about 100,000 years ago. Thankfully, it is very extinct. It was a member of the vampire bat group. These are bats that feed on the blood of other mammals generally. For the most part, this is relatively harmless. The problem is their ability to spread diseases, and a very large vampire bat would likely carry some more risk, if for no other reason than greater risk of infection from bacteria when they penetrate the skin. There's also a risk with vampire bats of things like rabies, so not everything is as simple as it might seem at first. The bat was clearly not shy, let's say. The remains were found in a cave that was known to be home to a giant sloth. At this time, the giant sloth was considered a form of megafauna, and that indicates that the vampire bat may have been feeding on some of the largest creatures of the time. Next is an article from chemists who are trying to find a way to turn water into a conductor. It's generally understood that water conducts electricity, but this is not true of pure water. Water you would be most familiar with has some sort of trace contaminants. These are what allow it to conduct electricity. If you have pure water, the nature of it doesn't allow the electron shells in the hydrogen and oxygen to overlap with other hydrogens and oxygen. This prevents the conduction of electricity if it is pure water. And this is where the research becomes interesting. they were able to turn the water into what is considered a metal, something capable of carrying a charge. The Chechen researchers could have simply put it under an environment where there was incredible atmospheric pressure, 48 million times what is found on Earth normally, and this would have worked, but it's not practical. Extremely impractical. What they did instead was to find a way to recreate this by using an alkali metal. They used sodium potassium. What's important here is that neither sodium nor potassium like being in water. In fact, they react extremely violently if they are in water. As a result, what happens when you would combine them normally is an explosion. The violence of that reaction can be seen in different places, and there'll be a link to a video in the description below. What's important with this study was that they found a way to add the metal to water in such a way that you didn't get this reaction, but you did get the ability to move electrons from the sodium-potassium alloy into the water, going now from what is cutting-edge chemistry to something that's a few years old. Golden rice. Golden rice is a genetically modified crop that's made with having vitamin A in mind. In many developing countries, children don't have access to vitamin A. This is because their foodstuffs are generally lacking in it. One of the staple foods they can access is rice, and if you find a way to have vitamin A fortified rice, you mitigate one of these big problems. A lack of vitamin A can cause all sorts of developmental problems, everything from blindness through to growth issues. The Philippines, as of the 23rd of July 2021, has approved the growth of golden rice, and this will become one of the first in the world to have approval to do so by regulators. Well, we should put that in context. It is the first country in the world that will benefit from the approval of golden rice. Countries like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States of America have approved it, but they don't need it for the most part. Those countries don't have significant concerns about children and vitamin A deficiencies. There is at least some chance that there will be pushback again. After all, there have already been several attempts to roll this out in various countries. One thing that has had strong pushback has been Bayer's development of glyphosates. This is commonly sold as RoundUp. Although today you will find it being manufactured by many countries, as the patent that was on glyphosates has long since expired. This means if you go into a store that stocks it, you will find many different brands, and perhaps RoundUp will be one of them. At least that's true for the next few years. After 2023, Bayer says it will end the sale of glyphosates to the consumer market. It will, however, continue to supply it for agriculture and industry. Despite what you may have heard from various court cases into glyphosate, there's very little scientific evidence that supports any issues with it. For the most part, it appears to be safe, and the few exceptional studies have significant glaring flaws. By contrast, the most recent examination was riddled with a variety of issues. We have a video in which we address the benefits and risk of glyphosate in greater detail. But in short, that study wasn't good. Then you have the court case, which concluded that yes, glyphosate somehow contributed to a cancer. That particular court case is touted as proof. The point being that although, yes, Bayer may have stopped making it available, it's a rather hollow victory. The companies that would now be sued in lieu of Bayer really aren't positioned to be able to pay out any lawsuit mounted against them. The international nature of some of these companies also further handicaps such attempts. Going now to space, and what is the current frontrunner for the peak of humanity's spacefaring ventures, the ISS. Although, after a somewhat rocky deployment, The Nauka module from Russia eventually made its way to the ISS. Here, it docked and the units became one. About 3 hours after it arrived, Nauka suddenly began deploying its thrusters. Not exactly what you want from your portion of the space station that's just arrived. For roughly an hour, the crew on board had to deploy thrusters on other modules to counteract the effect and try and keep it in place. The upside is that, at least, the thrusters can no longer pose such a risk. They have no fuel remaining. Going now to a final story for this week. The bizarre attempts by various groups and individuals to get social media influencers, particularly YouTubers, to start spreading false information. This particular story is noteworthy for a few reasons. The primary factor is the not only significant red flags, but lack of knowledge about how laws apply to places like YouTube in different countries. In very broad terms, the YouTubers were offered about €2,000 or about 2,400 American dollars to include a small sponsored section, but they weren't to tell people it was sponsored. Instead, it was to be a spontaneous attempt to express concern for others. In Germany, at least, where one of these YouTubers is from, that's incredibly illegal. Further to that, there are issues around just what they were trying to get them to spread. Notably, very false information that was data cherry-picked and cobbled together from a variety of sources to misrepresent the number of deaths related to the CCP virus vaccines. The attempt to spread misinformation also included a number of links to articles which more or less appear to be copy and paste jobs. After the YouTubers went public with what has been spread, others have come forward. The articles that were meant to be the linked material have been removed, and now both French and German authorities are investigating the country that was trying to recruit people to spread such misinformation. Unfortunately, it does appear that at least 2 individuals did sell their soul for a handful of silver, notably an Indian tech YouTuber and a Brazilian prankster, both of whom made unusual posts and similar in the vein of what was requested for the ad brief. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.